Herkese merhabalar, hoş geldiniz.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Tirşe Erbaysal Filibeli. I'm a member of academia. I will be chairing this panel on freedom of expression and hate speech. We have Joanna Szymanska from Article 19 will be with us. And from Minority Rights Group, we have Katarzyna Morton as the second speaker, to be followed by Kerem Altıparmak as the third speaker from Ankara University. Not anymore. I'm being warned by the speaker himself. Okay, not anymore in Ankara University. I think everyone knows who Kerem is. So Kerem Altıparmak will be with us. Probably he's going to answer our questions regarding the latest regulation. There are a couple of points I'd like to underline before we get started concerning freedom of expression and hate speech. It's a hot topic, especially after the pandemic. There has been legislative changes introduced regarding disinformation. And concerning how to handle disinformation, governments introduced new laws and legislation. The point is it the governments or the platforms who will control the information? That's the main question. So Turkey also has some legislative amendments. And there is a war between governments and social media platforms. Who controls what? No one knows. The governments want to control it. According to a research by Point, in 52 countries, there are legislative acts about that. And concerning freedom of expression, the question is to what extent these legislative amendments limit the right to freedom of speech. And this is also bringing to the table the question of what is the definition of hate speech, disinformation. Let's start with Joanna Szymanska with this panel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for invitation. I'm glad to be here again after a few years of a break and a pandemic. It's good to be able to speak about these issues in person again. So I represent Article 19. This is a global freedom of expression organization, and we've been working on a topic of hate speech for several years already. Quite often we can hear that there is a conflict between the right to freedom of expression and equality and non-discrimination, that these rights may perhaps be in opposition to one another. This is not true, and this is what our organization has been stating for years, setting up different policy papers, publishing materials, both on international standards related to freedom of expression, but also practically trying to implement these policies on the ground in different countries. We are certain that freedom of expression and the right to equality and non-discrimination are mutually reinforcing rights, and there is both of them, they cannot be implemented when the other is not implemented as well. So we believe that in order to have freedom of expression and this right to be to be as a fundamental right by the states, then there needs to be also the equality and non-discrimination in society, and all these rights should be implemented by the states. We are all experts here, so I don't want to say things that you already know, but I wanted to share a presentation that we use for trainings, for journalists, but also for civil society activists, in order to explain this relationship, let's say, between freedom of expression and equality, non-discrimination, and so to speak, combating hate speech. Perhaps you already know this publication because it was published a couple of years ago. We have a toolkit which is called Hate Speech Explained, and we use this toolkit in order to explain what is hate speech, what is the relation with freedom of expression, and what to do in order to effectively tackle hate speech. And obviously, the main issue that everyone that works on hate speech encounters at the beginning is that there is no one definition of what hate speech is, and this causes problems because I can present here what our organization thinks hate speech is. Then when we Google this, we will find dozens and dozens of other definitions, and also social media platforms that were mentioned already. They also all have different definitions of how they scope hate speech, and this causes problems not only in such policies but also in national legislation. We have totally different legislation when it comes to hate speech or incitement to violence and hatred across Europe. And the main issue with this legislation in different countries are protected characteristics. So which groups are in fact protected by the legislation. Unfortunately, in many countries, the list is not large enough. Even in the European Union, although in 2004, a big group of new countries joined the European Union. They were not obliged to add other groups, more groups to be protected by the legislation. So mostly when we are talking about sexual orientation or gender identity, these are the common characteristics that are not protected by the law in different states, including in the European Union, and that is not only when we are talking about hate speech, but unfortunately also about hate crime cases. So obviously that's one of the problems that we've been always vocal about, that the list of protected groups are often not big enough and they don't contain very important very important characteristics and groups. And when talking about different of typology of hate speech, this is the pyramid that obviously is known and it's used by human rights defenders. So we operate at the level of identifying three main groups of hate speech, if I can say so. So first group at the top is the hate speech that must be restricted. And this is based on applicable international legal instruments, mainly Genocide Convention, Rome Statute, and also International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So what these documents say that must be restricted is incitement to genocide and other violations of international law, and advocacy of discriminatory hatred constituting incitement to hostility, discrimination, or violence. And then in the middle there is the hate speech that may be restricted by legislation. And this is hate speech which may be restricted to protect the rights or reputations of others. So I will just explain in a while, like I will show what kind of graphics we use to explain the differences when we talk about hate speech with our target groups. And here I wanted also to add that when we work with journalists and we work like myself, I work in Eastern Europe, where often the environment for freedom of expression in these countries is already very limited. So when journalists hear about tackling hate speech, quite often their first reaction is like they are against it, because for them it's another form of adding more censorship to their work. That's why it's very important for us to explain that this is not the case, and tackling hate speech doesn't limit freedom of expression. And then there is the bottom layer, which is the hate speech that raises concerns in terms of intolerance in society and needs to be addressed, but in other ways than legal prosecution. And that's just the same typology of hate speech, just shown in a bit different way. So in the first group we have this incitement to violence, so there is some target audience that is supposed to be incited by the given speech, but there is also obviously this middle group, which are expressions individually targeting some individual, because we don't need to have incitement to violence and an audience in order to have hate speech and violation of someone's rights. That's why this is also reflected in the pyramid that I've just shared. So then to further distinguish these groups, we use this kind of graphics. So this graphic shows this hate speech that contains the incitement to violence, hatred, or discrimination. And this is when we have the hate speaker who has a public audience that he or she wants to influence by their expression. And then there is the target group that is at risk of acts of discrimination, hostility, or violence. But as I mentioned, there is also the other category that doesn't require to have target audience. It's the speech that is that targets an individual or several people, but it's just like there is no audience involved, and obviously such examples of hate speech can result in not just in insults, in threats, but also they can lead to further hate crimes. So this is how we try to explain the different categories of hate speech as per international human rights standards. Then we have this group of different expression that we see as not automatically hate speech. And many of them are actually being misused by governments in order to stifle opinions or to target activists, human rights defenders, or journalists. And they are often used by the state officials as like hate speech cases, although they are not. And as an example, like we have here, okay, so I just need to put it a bit closer to me. Like deeply offensive expression, it's not automatically hate speech, mainly because when there is no like this component of targeting someone based on their protected characteristic, like not every deeply offensive expression is automatically hate speech. Blasphemy or defamation of religions, obviously every individual based on their religion or belief must be protected from hate speech and from hate crime. But many states also target citizens who criticize religion itself or religious leaders, and this is not hate speech for the reason that like hate speech is about people and targets people and not institutions or some ideas such as religions. So blasphemy laws often actually are used to target opposition, to target activists, journalists who criticize some government decisions or who criticize some involvement of political leaders in certain situations. So this needs to be distinguished. That it doesn't mean we allow, like we say that like that hate speech is okay when it comes to religion. It means that international human rights standards protect individuals, people, groups of people, and not concepts, not ideas, and not institutions. So that's the difference that needs to be made. Then also one of those here, it's protection of the state and public officials. I think, yeah, I could think of a couple of situations from different countries where public officials actually misuse the hate speech provision or argument when it's basically just criticism towards politicians, towards governments. Obviously, we state that both politicians of different political parties, but also the governments, they they should be criticized and they should be more tolerant towards criticism, and they are not a protected characteristic per se. So criticizing them is not hate speech, and that's not always clear. And then when it comes to responses to hate speech, there are three areas of action that we believe that needs to go to be implemented at the same time in order to be effective. And as we know, and we've heard a lot of stories today, it's not easy to have first states that create an enabling environment for the exercise of the right of freedom of expression and protect the right to equality and non-discrimination. Enacting a range of positive policy measures that I will mention a bit more in detail in a while. And there is also the third group, very important, what we've been talking about today. These are the initiatives by civil society that help to tackle the root causes of prejudice and intolerance. And when it comes to positive policy measures by states, I was very interested today when we heard our colleague from Bulgaria giving an example of actually politicians and even the president speaking out against discrimination. This is that's the first on the list here, recognizing and speaking out against intolerance. That's what politicians should do, but we perfectly know that in many cases that's the government or politicians that spread hate speech, and they do it deliberately. So then that's why when we hear about some success stories, good examples, it's very reassuring, because unfortunately still it's the governments or political parties that deliberately share hate speech, disinformation, and they want this discrimination to be spread in the society. Then there is public education and information campaigns, very important in what states can do. Equality training, so it's trainings for judges, for prosecutors, for police. Obviously, all these measures, in order to implement them, there needs to be a lot to be done in a given country. In reality, it's often difficult to have the state, the government, cooperate with human rights defenders on these aspects. And what's very important is that there should be public policy for pluralism and equality in the media, because, like I said, freedom of expression is crucial for equality and non-discrimination. When we have then we have different voices that are heard in the media. There are representatives of marginalized groups that are being heard, that are invited. This is possible only when there is media pluralism. When there is no pluralism, then these marginalized groups are further marginalized, because they are not heard, and their voices are not published. So these are the main measures that states can do. And at the end, I just wanted to share how we explain the 6-part test from the Rabat Plan of Action, which is the UN-backed document from 2011 that is about ensuring equality with while maintaining freedom of expression. And this six-part test shows the 6 points that should be taken into account when we try to define and identify hate speech. So this is both, it can be used by the courts, but it can be also used in monitoring of hate speech. So these are what needs to be taken into account is the context of the expression, existence of conflict in society, existence and history of institutionalized discrimination, legal framework, media landscape, political landscape. Then the speaker, so the position of the speaker. Obviously, someone with big audience has more influence on people than someone who just shares such ideas among a group of friends. Intent, content of the expression needs to be also taken into account. Extent and magnitude of the expression, so public nature of the expression, the means of the expression, and 6, it's not necessary, but it can be also taken into account. So likelihood of harm occurring, including its imminence. So just also taking account how much the expression affected the society or the audience. Unfortunately, I would like to see some research how the Rabat Plan of Action is used in practice, but I haven't seen yet, and perhaps it's something that we should also focus on. And yes, that's all. I just wanted to share useful resources, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We will continue with Katarzyna Morton. Her presentation will be about accountability and freedom of opinion. So we may continue.
Sure. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Katarzyna, but I will title myself Kate to make it easier for everyone. So I made a long presentation, but I also want to hear what my colleague said to be sure that I'm not over repetitive. So if I skip some slides, please don't feel offended. It's just because I assume you already heard that. First of all, I would like to, in this panel, a little bit stimulate your thoughts. I'm not promising that I will deliver answers on what is the difference, let's say, what is the relationship between freedom expression and hate speech. And because, as my colleague said, in beautiful ideal world, there is no conflict, but since we do not live in the beautiful ideal world, I rephrase that, and I want to talk about the relationship between accountability and freedom of thoughts. So first, maybe a little bit what was already mentioned. My background is an information tracker, as I call it. So I try to work in my life in a very different positions to see how the information actually is traveling in different places, because I feel the reality we are observing and the communication we are observing, it's not the one context, okay, this is how we do the strategy here, this is how we do this here. It's a fluid world. And I think to know overall how the information and how hate speech and communication functions in different places and how fluids between them is more important than working on a special angle. So I put myself in all these different parts in my, let's say, career for the 15 last years. So first of all, the mainstream media. And while saying about my experience, it's not about speaking about myself. but more or less giving you an idea. So we have a map of how the information and hate speech is disseminating and how it travels. So mainstream media, as it was already said before, this is also what I worked about with journalists and training journalists, is one of the sources when the communication and the information is being broadcasted and goes to the online world. So when we speak about hate speech online, we have a feeling that it's like a separate reality. Obviously, there is no such a thing. Whatever comes in the mainstream media flows down to the online world produces some beautiful piece or controversial piece and is elevated up to the mainstream media. So we always have to look at this as a one thing, not separate pieces. In mainstream media, as was already said, it's important that the media are produced in a balanced way. So for example, if you go to Sarajevo and you want to speak or you make a reportage about the women, you need to make sure that you speak to the women experts and male experts when you ask for opinions. You want to be sure that you speak to different females from different layers of the society. You want to be sure that you take one opinion and the other opinion to make a balanced report that shows different sides of the story. Okay, in ideal world at least. Online world is something that is also producing media. So I put these little dots there. So somewhere there you will have Facebook pages, you will have internet portals, you will have also news outlets, so everything that produces content as well. And obviously there is an interrelation. So creating media is also when the communication happens, so there how it's created, a little bit like in mainstream media. For example, you are campaigners, you want to make a video that is defending, let's say, rights of minorities, and you will be creating media that you will insert into the online world and make it circulate there. Obviously, after that, the most important piece, and often forgotten, is the dissemination of information. So we like to put information in it, but we forgot sometimes that how this information spread is even more important. So on this angle, which for me it was the most interesting to work on, is how to put the information. So for instance, if you have Syrian refugees coming and you are in Poland, and in Poland there was a lot of backlash against that, and also in media and also in the online media, you produce a video, which is an interview with a Syrian refugee of 5 minutes, so not the news, when people can get to know him, and you translate it in Polish because you want Polish people to get closer and direct with a refugee to not imagine a number and to not imagine a threat. You want to put it in the online world, so you publish it somewhere. Maybe it's your Facebook, or maybe if you're a journalist, you can publish it on any other outlet that is bigger. And then you have to measure who watched it, how did it happen, and did it go really to the right audience, or just your mom and your friends watch it? Because then, even if you did a great job, it did not give the effect. So the dissemination of information, of how many people share it, do I have contacts, do I have network, is this information really countering hate speech, or is it just a bubble that it's stuck there, is important. And then you have, obviously, the context, which is the political environment, so how politics affects, and the international politics. I'll just skip this because it was already said. So when we come back to freedom of speech and hate speech, and freedom of thoughts and accountability, we will obviously have the arguments that will tell us why it's important to be able to express ourselves. And we will not discuss this because all you know that it's a market of ideas, personal freedoms are important, and obviously when we discuss, we learn about the other person. So even if someone tells me, okay, I am afraid of migrants, they will come and take my jobs, in some way I learn what are the fears of the society. This is a knowledge and this is an understanding in some way. So obviously there are positive sides of that. Now, where is the problem when we start to think about this, and this blurry line that we sort of don't want to see it, but it's there. So first are your thoughts. Of course, we have right to think this is really we have right to. Like in your head, you can be afraid and hate whoever you want. This is your full right in your head to have your own thoughts. Now, there will be an expression of your thoughts, whether you're a powerful journalist, whether you're a politician, or whether you're a person that is expressing thoughts on your social media. You will have to make a decision between your thinking and between action of expressing it. And this decision is your accountability. And the accountability is one of the most less tangible but important aspect of this. So I need to decide that I will, in the context I want, express my opinion. And that decision, whether the politician goes out and try to say some stigmatizing comment about any vulnerable group, or whether this is media who is producing maybe not directly full of hate speech piece, but piece that is sort of directing people into thinking that this group is causing that or that. Every time this happens, a human being takes a decision. And this is when the accountability is most important. And now, when you're thinking about this from the freedom speech defender's point of view, you're thinking, okay, but I want to be able to express my thoughts. What's the harm with that? We already been put here in the presentation what exactly, what kind of expressions are forbidden. But we know that there is a very big piece of information and expression that is not forbidden, but may be harmful as if it would be almost criminalized. And what's the difference? Context. So the power. So of course, if I am a female and I am writing the article about the fact that I think white men always hold the power and they should all be taken down. But if I am writing this in a society that is full of powerful white male, obviously this is maybe not nice, but it's not harmful, or at least it's not very harmful, because it takes a lot to take them down. So if you are men, and you are, for instance, when you are in Pakistan and you are writing or you're producing video in which you will say something that, I don't know, the religious minorities are really, dragging our economy down, in a place that is obviously Pakistan, when the minorities are anyway under prosecution and anyways marginalized, well, even if it's your opinion and per se, maybe, you have some rights, well, but in that context, when the power dynamic is completely different, it does become harmful. So as you see, the trick is always into judgment and accountability, whether you are able to understand the context are you speaking. So sometimes, for example, I have not the best relationship with the Catholic Church in Poland and with the institution. So I'm far from judging religion, I'm just judging institutions as for myself. And I feel very free to, say whatever I want, and I also had the possibility to write some articles about this, because I'm sure that, I will bringing things to the debate, and I know that nothing's really is going to happen in a sense that this hate speech, it's not going to turn into hate speech. But at the same time, I rarely criticize myself in Polish media communities as, for instance, Muslim communities, because even though I, in principle, disagree with the same institution, I feel very scared that if I would do this, actually anyway marginalized, refugees that are, or people who are just studying, will hold the consequences of my criticism. And of course, sometimes people, when I am, let's say, debating in public, they will say, okay, well, you're speaking this about the Catholic Church, but when we come to Muslims, you're like, no, defend them, don't say it. Yes, but the power dynamic behind that is completely different. And this is my accountability to make a decision that in this context I say it, and in this context I don't say it. And it's not because I'm fake, or it's not because I'm hiding my opinions, but because I understand the context of the situation. So now, both of those things, context and accountability, is something that is very blurry. So you cannot put it in law, you cannot really educate people of how to be compassionate, ethical, and how to feel morals, but it's something that actually defines it crucial. If you think about this, if we were all accountable, and if we were all living in the system that is equal, we would not need to even regulate freedom of expression, because we all knew for ourselves whether to speak or not. And now the same thing is when we speak about the people. So from the other point of view, if you think about the thoughts, when you're dealing with a hate speech, and when you're judging yourself, is my accountability in order, you will need to see all the situation behind it. So they are my thoughts, and of course, I process them differently. And I'm speaking with a person that may have different opinions because has different knowledge, different beliefs, different awareness, experience, and with brought in a different context. And we both will make a decision whether to say things or whether to not say things. And in that sense, for example, one time it happened to me that I was being part of the campaign that was speaking about the pro-democratic rights, also in Poland. And people said that National Party in Poland came into force because people who voted for them were uneducated and a little savage. Well, maybe by the statistics they were having less degree in education, but saying this, even though it was a statistic even, not a savage part, in fact, you were actually, somehow depriving people's dignity in the context, how you said that, in that particular term. So when we were all the time, so it's in different words, thinking about this, the thought of us and a decision to make it into expression and how to impact the words and in the context that it is. All right, so another thing is to think of that obviously hate is something that we all feel differently. And this is the most brilliant line, because we can have a law that says this or that, but as long as people feel differently about what is hateful to them, well, your law does not really apply to how the reality functions, because people are emotional beings and they function according to their beliefs. So even if you say, okay, this is not a hate speech when I am, speaking things about religion, but if people live by their religion and it's dear to them, this feels hateful to be directly speaking of someone's religion. So when we tackle this problem and we think about this, I think with all the great structure for all the strategies, we cannot forget that people are diverse and they have different emotions and beliefs. And when we address the communication, we don't only throw our own idea about this, but we take it from their point of view and from their type of feelings in order to make it work. And this is the difference between the boundaries and the limits. So limits is something when they're law limiting us to not do or do things, and boundaries is something that we feel emotionally we shouldn't or should do. All right, so this I skip, as I said. Okay, so that was the one thing just to leave you to reflect on. And I don't think we will ever have a conclusion to this, because it's a process, it's not a fact. So every time you are in this situation, you will have to go through the same process. Maybe you will be in another context producing media, you have to, again, go through the same process. You need to ask yourself if you understand a person that you're speaking to, if you understand yourself, and if you producing or counter-producing media do actually, reach the person's mind and do actually give justice to the case, not only from your point of view, also from other person's point of view. So I was being told I can say something additionally if I have time. Do I have time? Yes. All right. So, okay, so now to be a little bit more practical about the campaign's impact when we counter. So as you know, all the type of different campaigns that counter hate speech on many different layers, they have different goals. Or if you don't have the different goals, they anyway achieve such result. So first thing is obviously whenever you want to, in this power dynamic, most importantly, raise the voice and defend, let's say, vulnerable communities, because as we spoke before, the power is not on the side. So again, me speaking about white men in the white society, different situation. When we speak about women in Afghanistan at this point, it's not the same impact. So obviously, you want to rise and you want to empower vulnerable communities to make it more equal. So even if we argue, we are a little bit in the same position. So empowering the vulnerable communities is just speaking up for them and giving them more place in the public sphere. Empowering public sphere with arguments is extremely important, because sometimes people who want to defend other people in online space do miss that job, let me say like that, because they themselves don't know arguments well enough. And I don't know if you had the opportunity, I'm sure, read some comments when people were like, no, let's say women, like this guy shouldn't speak because, men always are speaking. Well, they do always speak, but maybe this time he's being an expert, invited to speak, so maybe we shall let him speak. So just saying the arguments requires the context. And sometimes, because people don't have the right argumentation, they use their own words to argumentation, and obviously that can counterbalance them and backlash them. So when we speak about the different, and we produce different campaigns, when you do your videos, when you do your text, when you do your, whatever it's the radio, you know that you also deliver the argumentation to people who may speak about this in the future, maybe in the home when they eat dinner, or maybe in the public sphere. So it's very important that it happens. Obviously, raising awareness about the issue. And the fourth most important question is, when you do it, who do you want to convince and why? So when you bring your campaign, or when you bring your, your rights or your cause, who are you actually speaking to? Because if you want to speak to people who are not convinced, are you sure that when you publish your article or when you publish your campaign, the way you did, you reach them? And are you sure they ever read it? Are you sure they ever process it? So to know and understand that is very important. So fun fact, I've been in some campaigns I was doing or people I was working with, one time people tell me, well, we should do this campaign, you know, about democracy, and maybe we can make this song, you know, with this folklore in it, like with the vibe of the folklore, and this is a very like well-positioned people who are doing serious stuff telling me, okay? And maybe when we produce this song with this folklore, you know, all these people from village will understand the democracy. Okay, so your jaw is down on the floor, and you're like, I don't think they're that stupid, you know? Like, you should not be thinking that that's just, you cannot trick people like that. And this is something when, you know, when you say, like, maybe you first go educate yourself, and then we're gonna educate other people. How about that? So the point is, if you do not know your audience, and by know, I mean, not judge, not assume, not think that I know, but really go and talk to people on the partnership level, not with assumption that you know better. Well, most of the campaigns you do will actually miss the point. You all probably have friends who weirdly have super weird, accordingly to opinions, and you don't know why, because they're super intelligent, and then they come with the stuff that you're shocked, you know? But when you talk more, well, there is a fear behind this, there is an unknowing behind this, and all different things. So to understand very well who is your audience and who you speak, but like really well, and really well means being in touch and contacting and really talking to them, not doing the research in internet about them, but with them, is a most important, let's say, one of the most important points. So this is also to summary. So you have the pitfalls that are happening within that. It's speaking to my bubble, self-satisfaction, great enemy of any campaign. So I produce something amazing and my team is great and we are volunteers or we are working and we achieve amazing things and that's why we've done job. No. You might do actually all of this, like you can imagine how much money European Union spent on a lot of different programs that no one of 1% of people who went to Erasmus ever attended. I mean, this money could go to, I'm sorry, I'm a big fan of European Union, but if you did your research and you weren't satisfied about releasing your new website with your new programs that no one knows about except of 1% of Erasmus students, maybe we would be in a different situation. So that comes to no measure and follow up. So because you're so self-satisfied and you have your budget counting and you did your campaign and you put it to donor, you maybe not always really measure if that really worked and on whom it really worked. And that is really has nothing to do with the professionalism. It's just sometimes how our mind is functioning. Wrongly defined goals, so the goals that we spoke about. So, you know, you think you're doing one thing, but in fact, you don't really sure is this gonna really work and you do different things but you know, in another direction. And again, communication built accordingly to your perception. So this is what I mentioned before. So what I think about the others, you know, doing the video clips with the folk, for sure will get people to democracy and this type of stuff. And okay, and a lack of understanding to whom do we speak, so profile, but also type of leadership. Type of leadership. When you're doing your counter campaigns, it's a different thing if you have people who are really maybe not having enough exposure to the topic that you're talking, this is your audience, and it's a different that you have paid governmental trolls that don't even believe in what they're writing. They're doing this because, you know, they have political goals. It's a completely different situation. I mean, hitting that campaign against countering this campaign and countering, you know, the let's more organic hate speech, it's like just a different weapons that have to be used there completely, and you need to know what you're dealing with. Oh, this is my last. Okay, great. Okay, so I did a little bit squeeze two different topics. So one was a little bit more abstract about the accountability, and one was a little bit more practical. Hope it made sense together. But at the end, I just want to tell that even if it sounds very banal to say, but it's like just so crucial to have a check on your own perception all over time, every time and every day, whenever you even have a conversation or whether you produce something, and on the perception on others, because at the end, everything that we do is is a result of our mind, and the accountability, so the decision whether I do or someone else do, is more important in some way than in an execution than the law that is being set in that. Because law gives us a frame, but at the end we will have to think how to execute within the law, and if our speech is going to be opinion, or if it goes to the ground with this balance of power, it's going to turn into the hate speech even if we don't mean it.
Okay, thank you, Katarzyna. By the way, there are some politicians who sound very accountable for some group of people here in Turkey when it comes to hate speech, you know.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Okay. Kerem Altıparmak'la devam edeceğiz.
We will continue with Kerem Altıparmak, who will talk about abuse of hate speech provisions in Turkey, criminalization of religious hate speech, or blasphemy.
I will speak in Turkish, so aslında
In fact, I had an hesitation whether or not I should speak in English or Turkish, but you will now see in a while I will be using a very local thing, so I put it all on the shoulders of our interpreters, at least for the audience following Turkish, will make them more familiar to our local circumstances. We did not have a previous discussion about which panelist will speak what, but now that we have this theoretical background, it matches very well with my talk, because I will be talking about how in an authoritarian regime, hate speech provisions do not really counter hate speech, but how they become an instrument for creating or reproducing hate speech itself. And I will be basing my talk also about the Turkish Criminal Code, Article 216. So this is the incitement to hatred and enmity based on religion. But let me first offer you a brief introduction. This was the former Article 312 of the Turkish Criminal Code. And the statements at that time, making statements, were being penalized, considering that their statements amounted to hate speech. And together with the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, the provision for having a clear and imminent danger was included in the provision. However, as you would appreciate, we can see some fictitious or fantastic judgments. Let me give you one example. The Central Council of the Turkish Medical Association made a statement that war is a matter of public health. This statement came during the Afrin operation. You may remember at that time the President of the Republic clearly targeted the Turkish Medical Association in his statement. And the members of the Central Council were detained, taken into custody. If I'm not mistaken, they remained in custody for 5 days. And later on, they were convicted of Article 216 of the Criminal Code. So one may think, how come war may be a matter of public health? Let me elaborate on this first. So the military was about to enter Syria, and there are Kurds in Syria. And since there are Kurds in Syria, and our army is entering into Syria, and one may have the perception that the actions are against Kurds because they are considered as enemy. So through such assumptions, the medical association's statement was considered that it was inciting public to enmity. And by the way, it can take many years for that kind of cases to be finalized. I would like to talk about the third paragraph of Article 216, which is about the state of person who publicly incites or denigrates public, who publicly denigrates others. However, when we look into the enforcement of these provisions, we can actually see that it is rather the paragraph 1 of Article 216 and not 3. So, the third paragraph foresees a prison sentence from 6 months to 3 years. That's being the case. It's not easy to convict them and offer them a prison sentence. So they initially detain people on charges of paragraph 1, but later on they convict due to paragraph 3. So there is a paradox here. And this government is claimed to have banned hate speech. However, the government itself has been producing or spreading hate speech, as it turned out. Let me give you an example. The students of Boğaziçi University, they used LGBTQI plus symbols on the holy Medina, on the holy shrine, and how they can ever use this, how they can ever use LGBTQI plus symbols on such a sacred religious site. Likewise, the Presidency of Religious Affairs made a statement about universities and civil societies, and with involvement of the Union of Various Associations, they also had to intervene in this case. So it is quite clear for us the appetite of the Turkish judiciary. Yet another example is the case of Sevan Nişanyan. Why is that important? Because it shows us this tension between free speech and hate speech. And you may remember Sevan Nişanyan was convicted. There was a film published on YouTube depicting the Prophet Muhammad. And as it created public indignation, Sevan Nişanyan penned an article on his personal blog. So there is a certain context. I mean, his article comes with a certain context. He didn't write it out of the blue. In France, Islamophobia does not only target religion, but also the people who are practicing religion. However, this is the case in France, and it is not necessarily the case in Turkey. And then he makes this following statement, saying that centuries ago, people who claim to have contact with Allah, making fun of this person or ridiculing this person does not amount to a criminal offense, he wrote. So there is a reference to the Prophet Muhammad, and the judicial authorities consider this as a blasphemy and as insulting the Prophet and the public denigration of the religious values of people. But is there any certain protection for any specific religion? No, we are talking about the protection of the religious values for the entire society. However, even though the provision makes no mention of any specific religion, it becomes a rule protecting Islam only. And What about the public order and peace? According to the judicial authorities, that also disrupted public order and peace. So if you can troll some others as a public figure, then it may be also a problem disrupting public order and peace. And this would be sufficient enough for the judicial authorities to consider this as a crime. One does not need the premise of clear and imminent danger. So it is enough premise for this to qualify as a criminal offense. This was the opinion of the judicial authorities. You may make a statement which may bother certain segments of the society, and your disturbing statement may be enough grounds for the authorities to investigate and prosecute you. So one aspect of the problems here is the boundaries of what is sacred. It is not only limited to the Prophet or to the God, to Allah. However, the boundaries of what is sacred constantly expanding. Another example is the tweet on Hayam. Hayam is the poet, and Fazıl Say, the pianist, wrote a tweet on Hayam. He was first convicted, but later on it was overturned by the Court of Cassation, by the upper court. Fazıl Say stopped using the social media for a while, and after he came back, he stopped using Twitter for that purpose. And then there is also the example of Fırat Eres. He was indeed put in detention. So Karamollaoğlu once claimed that there can't be any lies in Islam. Lies have no place in Islam. However, Fırat Eres wrote back saying that it is possible to see lies in Islam. So this is why he was detained. But since he could not be present based on 216 third paragraph, he was put into prison in line with paragraph number 1. And this is again the case of both university students, the use of LGBTQI plus symbols on sacred religious sites, and a picture of sacred sites. And here is the case about the bar associations, Ankara Bar Association and Diyarbakır Bar Association. The Presidency of Religious Affairs makes statements about homosexuality and how it doesn't have any place in Islam. And he also makes statements about adultery, and adultery is a great sin, and many people committing the offense of adultery are now infected with this virus. So he is clearly making connotations. He's clearly trying to establish a linkage between the virus and homosexuality. And afterwards, the bar associations made a statement that we have been perplexed to hear from the president of a religious authority that he could make such a statement about certain segments of society. So eventually they were prosecuted on publicly insulting a civil servant. So yes, these are all the sacred values or sacred sites. Another example about that. But there is one more. Hakan Aygün wrote a tweet about IBAN numbers. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we were going through a crisis. It's a health emergency, and people have been providing bank account numbers on TVs. This may definitely end up like lost in translation moment. But as of today, Fırat Enes was investigated with the first paragraph of Article 216, but later on he was arrested on the third paragraph. Likewise, in other cases, insulting the president of the country, for instance, there is a certain time you can actually detain these people. And later on, there was a constitutional court ruling. The constitutional court ruled that this constituted a violation of rights, since one cannot make such an arrest based on the first paragraph. Another example, spreading videos of Ciao Bella song. So, in fact, the Ciao Bella song is played from the mosque, from the loudspeakers of the minaret, and those who shared this video, they were called to offer their statement, and later on arrested. And it almost becomes like a pattern that once you see that someone captured the moment of Ciao Bella song being played from the loudspeakers of a mosque, and then the next sentence would immediately be that they are detained. Another example, enjoying rakı at a dinner table on a holy religious day. And then, when people saw that photo, there was a public indignation as to how come people on such a holiday can ever drink rakı. So again, we see the importance of protection of a religious value or a sacred value. So you may want to drink rakı, but especially in those days, one had to think twice before inviting someone else for rakı. And they also detained this person. He was taken into police custody, but later on he was not arrested. So this is the last example of countless other examples. I used to be a faculty member at Ankara University once, and I had to be a lawyer or advocate for my student. So this is a case about an imam. Imams would talk to students every time we have some religious feasts. But I'm again talking about this sacred space because its boundaries keep expanding. There is also a certain difference between an imam taking up the podium and speaking to university students, and also a person in religious attire doing the same. So in this particular case, there was an acquittal verdict. However, students who have never ever been to this particular faculty of political sciences, they were immediately engaged in discussion. How come this person making a speech is role-playing an imam, and how can you imitate an imam in a university? And it is not acceptable to see an imam being portrayed in a negative light. This is what we understand at the end of the day. So how certain things end up in hatred by sheer provocation. I don't know if you have seen this before. There is this Zara, the brand, and then there is this Zara, the singer. And Zara also married a conservative columnist, so I thought she was a conservative one. But in fact, this image, on the other hand, is an image from the Zara brand. But because they used a photo where bread is being smashed by a shoe, they thought that this was done by Zara, the singer. Once they saw the name Zara, they started writing very angry messages against the artist. So, after all these examples, let me try to offer you a more conceptual framework. When I go to visit a prosecutor in his office, he always tells me free speech is not limitless. It comes with its own limits. But we need to understand the boundaries, these limits. Where do these limits start? Where do they end? Yes, free speech, freedom of speech is perhaps not unlimited. So freedom of expression, according to the additional provision of the American Constitution, of the US Constitution, that there are very clear definitions. And there are so many conventions we have been talking about, but indeed there are very few definitions, and freedom of expression is central to many other fundamental rights. And it should not be something vague. If we need to live in a free society, in a democratic society, this is one of the basic necessities, just like air and bread. And it is very important that you have such a trump card, so that you can always use this trump card when needed. And this can also be likened. One cannot make hate speech equal to protecting religion or religious values. There may be a certain conflict or tension between the freedom of expression and freedom of religion or conscience. For instance, these people who were drinking alcohol or rakı on a religious day, to what extent they have impacted the rights of others? Or a student who came up to the university podium and role-played an imam, how come he affected the lives of others or the religious rights of others? They claim that they find it offensive, or they feel very sad about such things, about religious. But I mean, this is not enough grounds for us to prosecute them. There is also a difference between blasphemy and hatred, religious hatred. It is quite similar to racism indeed. They are being targeted only because they are Muslim. And at least in Turkey, if we cannot really apply Article 216 in this country, that is the Sunni Muslims. We cannot really apply the second paragraph to Sunni Muslims. On the other hand, one can always change religion as opposed to his or her race. And I can always criticize religion. Sometimes I may do so by using humor. Sometimes I may question the very existence of religions. This has nothing to do with the public sphere. If you build your power around religion, then of course we will see divisions as Sunnis and Alevis. And then it will become a political matter, a political debate. One cannot do this in race because one cannot change his or her race or skin color. Yet religion might be changed, as it seems, depending on the political debate. And the belief of the majority turns into an instrument for assimilation. We have mandatory religious classes in this country. And it's one of the apparatus of doing so. And Article 216 is also enforced in this light. I mean, you cannot even make a criticism, then you will be considered as questioning public morals. And then there is also the perspective of the victim and the issue of harm. Who is the victim? The victim is those who cannot enjoy their rights, but on the other hand, harm is done to either to Allah, to the state, and not really the people. It is not really realistic that 99% of a country is made up of Muslims. There may also be non-believers living in this society. So if we are to talk about hate speech, then we should talk about individuals who cannot exercise their right of religion or conscience. They can be the victims. On the other hand, yes, in other parts of the world, or even in Turkey, communities, society as such, or even the state may be a victim too, but this is not what we are talking about right now. And what about the harm? Where do we see the harm? As I said, hate speech can be used as a very strong trump card, and those who advocate using hate speech as a trump card sees a difference between a hate speech or an action. It is not possible to inflict pain or damage only through words. And that's why we talk about speech acts. There are times where only a speech can have its consequences and can be considered as a speech act. And it all relies on the public dignity and equality. Everyone should have the chance to benefit from equal citizenship or a dignified life. Jeremy Mulder, in his book, talks about this. He gives several examples of speech acts. However, none of these examples that we have experienced in our country are tantamount to speech act. Would expressions about belief or religion disrupt public security or public order? Let me also talk about heckler's veto. We will oppress, we will make a lot of noise, we will make it disappear. So I have said a lot today, and then after my speech you may target me with your verbal criticism, but afterwards you may resort to physical violence. You start beating me, and then at some point the state itself stops you from beating me. And unfortunately, we have experienced a very grave, a very dark moment. It was the Sivas massacres in Turkey. Aziz Nesin, he was there. So who was the victim there? It was not the people who set fire on this hotel in Sivas where intellectuals were staying. The victim was the intellectuals, and we cannot really turn it around by arguing with heckler's veto. So here is the bottom line. If you are bothered, do not check photos of people who drink alcohol on a religious day. Do not watch their statements. Let them live their own belief. Let them live their non-belief. But this is definitely is not the hate speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You gave us a chance to think over the definition of hate speech once again. Social media platforms have their own way of defining it. Other actors have their own ways. Media has a certain way of defining it. But it all depends on the context, as you said. That's what I can say concerning the freedom of expression. We also discussed about the limits of hate speech, freedom of expression. I want to turn to the audience if they have any questions. Otherwise, I have many. Do you have any questions? I will go ahead. Okay. There's a question in the audience. Thank you for the presentations. I have a question to Kerem Bey. The Parliamentary Justice Committee worked on the social media aspect. To what extent do you think they can expand the scope of hate speech given the recent legislative changes? It's not directly linked to the hate speech, but Article 8 could be relevant here, referring to Law 5651. Article 8. In case of commission of certain crimes, the content could be taken down. According to this article, we're stuck with fake news, but fake news is just one aspect of this horrible piece of legislation. There is a need to have a decision taken by the judge of civil court of first instance. Without any court decision, there will be a way to take down the content according to the legislative changes. Think of espionage, because there are new provisions concerning espionage too. That might be used or misused as basis. But because you referred to the hate speech, I think I get your question better now, because it refers to 217/A. For example, there might be a claim, you lie about Turkishness, you lie about our president, or one can claim you're lying about our army. Whether it's true or not, it might be, yes, partially linked to hate speech articles, so the scope could be expanded, yes. How do you think that is going to impact the public security as an imminent threat? Well, it depends on to what extent they're going to expand the scope. It could be used as a legitimate basis. The world is also discussing about fake news. During the course of the pandemic, some circles were trying to prevent some people wearing masks. I mean, if that happened, given the context, then just because some people discouraged people from wearing masks, what does that mean? Is that an imminent threat to public security? You may want to stop that person making such expressions, but in our case, the basic concern in the legislation is whether you go beyond your intent, whether you create an influence beyond your intent or not. If you take down that content, you will just exceed the line. I think this refers to the expression saying burning the entire library for the sake of destroying one single book. In Turkey, when you want to pass a legislative act, there is no proper consultation taking place among the stakeholders. Unfortunately, that's how legislation is made in Turkey. But actually, when one needs to make law, one needs to have a proper consultation, negotiation. There should be a solid basis. So freedom of expression is an important trump card there. And it should be used for very exceptional circumstances. It's not that in every round of the game you can pull up the trump card. No, you should resort to the trump card, which is freedom of expression, in very exceptional circumstances, but unfortunately it's being abused. As you see in my presentation, other provisions are interpreted in such a broad way, especially that provision will certainly be interpreted in even a broader way. There is a legislative change concerning this information, and it refers to disruption of public security and peace. And it implies an authoritarian regime, and it significantly hinders freedom of expression. This is taking our country to a worse situation in the rankings. According to the most recent amendment, there is a reference to public security and peace again. But I think German example could be referred to as a good practice. We know that country has been working for quite some time on the definition of disinformation and hate speech. In Turkey, we don't have a definition. What is it exactly, disinformation and hate speech? We're trying to prevent that, but we don't know what we're trying to prevent because it doesn't have a definition in Turkey. I think we will end up finding ourselves under heavy censorship eventually. There are changes made in Article 56-51. It, of course, influences freedom of speech. We follow the developments closely. The numbers are growing every year. I wonder what will happen next year. What is your take on that concerning next year? Probably the recent changes will result in self-censorship. There's a risk, says the speaker. Not just in this aspect, in many aspects. While preparing this speech, I checked other country examples concerning blasphemy. For example, in the UK, this was repealed in 2008. But before 2008, in the UK, the most successful prosecution took place in 1979. So, very long time ago. There was another example, a person who was sentenced to 6 years imprisonment because of insult to president in Sweden. This insult was against Swedish king. How relevant is that? In Turkey, there are 150,000 people who are charged with insulting president. In Sweden, there is only one person in many, many decades. Well, those legislative acts will be resorted to very frequently, I am sure. I believe freedom of expression, which is already very limited in Turkey at the moment, will be even more limited in the future, in the coming years. Social networks assign representatives to countries, right? They set up branches in different countries, but they are not subject to any sanctions, according to the local legislation. But now we have this disinformation article, according to the legislative changes. According to that, if the social media company fails to provide the government with relevant information regarding that specific usage, then the government will have a right to limit 70%, 90% of the bandwidth of that social platform company. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu may, for example, deliver a speech and say president is lying, In that case, nothing is going to happen to Kılıçdaroğlu because he is the leader of the opposition. But if you, as a Twitter user, retweet what Kılıçdaroğlu said, you will definitely be prosecuted, in my opinion. And if Twitter fails to provide information concerning this user about that tweet to the government, then the government will punish the the social network company. So there will be very grave consequences. Do you have any other questions? Otherwise, I think we can finish this session. Thank you very much.